Okay, guys, so now we are ready. Oh, you know what? I forgot the rest of the sentence. Oh, no. Okay, so here we go. So now we're on what I'm calling page 204, but basically it's paragraph D that starts with relying on a half-century-old study. So let's go ahead and work closely through this page. Relying on a half-century-old study is less than ideal. So they're talking about the study that was cited in paragraph C, if you want to go back and get that information again, but necessary. Few sociologists study looting specifically, but interviews with half a dozen experts on protest and social movements provide some insights into the looters' motivations. Okay, so now he's giving us another point of view. Which discipline is he pointing to? Sociologist. And I'm wondering if any of you took a sociology class in the summer or are taking one now. Is your sociology professor, and I guess it depends on the nature of the class and the topic and which course it is your sociology professor, has your sociology professor made use of anything that's going on to help you apply what you're learning in that class? I know if I was a sociology professor, it would be just all about either COVID-19 and the killing of George Floyd and the aftermath. But anyway, now we see that he is drawing from what he claims are experts, right? He's appealing to an authority of people who've been trained to study society and how it works. And in particular, those who are scholars, sociologists who are scholars of looting. So people have done a lot of critical thinking about what makes society function the way it does, what makes subgroups the way they are, and how they interact with each other in the majority group, and how they navigate systems of power and whatnot. So, as you can see here, let's go back to the sentence. But interviews with half a dozen experts on protest and social movements. So these are some more key concepts right here that are being somehow connected to looting. Provide some insights into looters' motivations. Okay, so now we see that he has this like transitional paragraph. He doesn't just start presenting sociological opinions. He gives us a nice transitional paragraph that says, hey, I just cited from an old sociological study, so he's doing a coherent tie to what he said before, and now he's getting us ready for what's coming next. So that's what makes for nice coherence. Transitional sentences are sometimes needed, questions, phrases, in this sense, this and here, he's using a transitional paragraph. We understand the discipline. He's going to be appealing to his source of information and what it is that these experts are going to be cited for. That is, their ideas on looting, protest, and social movements with respect specifically to what? Looters' motivation. So why? So we're getting to that question of why do people loot? So let's get to paragraph E. For one thing, looters and peaceful protesters, I'm going to make that one concept, aren't typically the same people. Dana Fisher, a sociologist at the University of Maryland, has studied protest for 20 years. And she says it's rare for peaceful protesters to start stealing and setting fires at random. People flock to sites of protest with different motivations. And those who want peace tend to stay peaceful. She says, I've never seen somebody come in who's peaceful, and then it's like, hey, we just broke that window over there. I'm going to now start looting, she told me. So that's interesting. She's saying, look, here in this quote, we might interpret her as saying this. There might be some violence that goes on. There actually might be some destruction of property in a protest, but that doesn't necessarily have to entail looting. So that's interesting as well. Is it permissible to sometimes destroy property, but never to loot the property that is destroyed? That's interesting. There are articles that talk about that, and this one might even touch on that as well. I've read it a few times. I've read so many articles, I can't remember if it's this one or not, but we'll find out. Okay, so this is really interesting right here because she's also talking about who's not doing the looting. So what kind of protesters don't do the looting? Those who are peaceful. Does she say that peaceful protesters are likely to start looting or not? No, she says they're likely to stay what? Peaceful. So she's making a distinction between what? Looters and, well, first of all, he makes a distinction. Oh yeah, he makes a distinction drawn, or he presents a distinction drawn by the sociologist Fisher between looters and peaceful protesters. This is interesting to think about. Did you make that distinction in your response to the case study about the black business owner in Deep Ellum? Did you make that distinction? Did you say it's okay to peacefully protest, or there's a right way to protest, and then there's looters? All right. Those in the looting group. Ooh, the looting group. So there's the peaceful protest group on the one hand, and the looting group, according to this article, also have varied motivations. So if you're looting, then it doesn't sound like you have peace in mind, or at least not in the immediate, like in terms of why you're out and about where the protesters are. In their 1968 study, Dines and Quartolini noted that vandalism during protests focuses on objects and buildings that are symbolic of other values. Okay, this is a very important point to make. So, this up here was about which discipline will he be presenting points of view. So that's a sociological perspective. Then he gives us a particular sociologist, Dana Fisher, and now he's going to the sociologist from the recent history that he's already cited, and he's giving their point of view. And that is that they have different motivations, the why. So getting to the question of why do people loot. In their so this one talks about which people aren't looting. The point of this is to make a distinction with respect to who's not doing the looting and why. What is their motivation? Well, they want to be peaceful, or at least that's part of it in terms of how they carry it out. But then, those aren't the only people out there the peaceful protesters. And so as he says, in their 1968 study, Dines and Quartolini noted that vandalism during protests focuses, okay, so we read that. So vandalism, protest, objects on buildings that are symbolic of other values. For example, people are more likely to attack symbols of authority, such as CNN buildings or police cars, than apartment buildings. So what does he mean by that? Symbolic of other values. When people do destroy property or they vandalize, right? What does it mean to be motivated by other values? And why would what is vandalized or destroyed be symbolic of those values? So imagine that somebody destroys a police car. Why might a protester, maybe not peaceful, okay, that's not peaceful, a destructive protester, let's call them, why might a destructive protester who's angry about what happened to George Floyd, why might that protester decide to vandalize a police car? Why would that be symbolic? Okay, so that's an interesting question for you to think about. Okay, let's say that, let's go to the CNN building example. Let's say, can you imagine why might someone want to destroy a CNN building after, the killing of George Floyd? What might be the issue with CNN? In other words, how does what is being vandalized represent the concern or the issues or the feelings of those who are vandalizing that property or object? In other words, what are the moral values, the moral concerns, the social concerns that are tied to the destruction of that particular thing, whether it be a building, police building, a CNN building, a Fox building, a police car, or what about a statue, of Robert E. Lee or something like that? Okay, so let's go ahead and continue. In this way, some of the looting is a lashing out against capitalism, the police, and other forces that are seen as perpetuating racism. Notice that he says some of the looting. So why do people loot? Well, they're lashing out. So think about what it means to lash out. What are the feelings that are typically associated with lashing out? Why and when do people lash out? Have you ever lashed out at somebody? What was the context? Why did you lash out? Has anybody ever lashed out at you? What was the context? Why did they lash out? Was it unusual for them to lash out? Do you lash out at people every day, or is it unusual? What has to be the case? Is there a tipping point? Is there a line that has to be crossed before you lash out? And notice what the lashing out is connected to when it comes to some of the looting. For some people, it's capitalism. For some people, it's the police or some other force where those forces, whether it's capitalism, the police, or something else, is perpetuating what? Racism. So the author is saying that according to some people, these sociologists, when some people are looting, they are doing it as a way to call attention to something that is instigating, perpetuating racism. Okay, so then it says widespread looting, which is, what of course happened this summer after the killing of George Floyd, that may perhaps be interpreted as a kind of mass protest against dominant conceptions of property, Dines and Cordellini wrote. It is a bid for the what? Redistribution of property. So that's interesting, and of course they were writing about this back in the 1960s. Some very interesting points, but notice the concepts that I've been highlighting here. Widespread looting against what? As a way of what? Lashing out against certain forces that perpetuate racism. Notice how I'm just focusing on the concepts and able to paraphrase that way. So when we see mass protests, we have to understand that sometimes mass protests happen so that people can voice and express their concerns about conceptions that are dominating how we should think about property. And what do they want out of it? They want to, when they say a bid for, they want to enact something to happen such that property is redistributed. Okay, it's portioned out differently than it is now. Do you see how I paraphrase just by focusing on the keywords in the paragraph? Of course, I had to read the paragraph, make sure I understood it, and then in my paraphrase, I have to make sure that I don't misrepresent or distort what is happening. That's the power of my concept triangle method. Okay, so let's do one more paragraph here. The part of what sociologist Andrea S. Boyle, so here's another point of view. So this one is the same one here. The part of what sociologist Andrea S. Boyle found when she interviewed dozens of people during the Ferguson unrest for her book, You Can't Stop the Revolution. Okay, this is, One of her interview subjects saw the looting of a Quick Trip convenience store as retribution for economic exploitation of the black community, Ted told her. But when he himself, oh, wait a minute, I think I'm missing a part, so I'm going to pause the video and find it.